Chapter 1. Lessons of Coin and Fire. The road taught the first lessons that no nest can give. They learned the weight of a coin not by counting it in a good ledger under a decent lamp, but by earning it and feeling how it weighs in the palm and refuses to be light when it has been honestly come by. They learned that roofs consent to keep rain off strangers only after a negotiation. They learned that beds are negotiable. They learned that kindness is real and so are swindles. And the cleverest comfort in the world is realizing you can sleep on clean straw if the company is honest. Riff knew the travelling grammar because Alaris and Lord Redder had made sure of it, not with lectures but with chores that had turned into reflex before she found out they were training too. She could haggle for oats without insulting the stable boy. She could notice a loose shoe on a horse long before it could be thrown and find a blacksmith by afternoon. She could rinse harness and oil leather with that patient economy good horsemen use when they intend to own their gear a long time. She carried a whetstone and used it on other people's knives for a copper and their gratitude for free. The first coin the three of them earned together was for carrying water and not spilling it. The inn at the market ford had hired out its tap to the festival, which meant buckets and barrels needed hands to fill and load. The innkeep stood in his doorway with his arms crossed and his mouth making calculations about profit and trouble in equal measure. "3 of you," he said, looking them over with the practiced eye of a man who has hired day labour before and been disappointed by it. "You look like you might break before the work's done." Riff shifted her lance to the other shoulder with the easy economy of someone who has carried weight before and will carry it again. "We won't break," she said, "and we won't spill." "Everyone spills," the innkeep said. "It's the nature of water and haste." "We won't," Marius said. And there was something in the way he said it, not boasting, just stating a fact he had already calculated, that made the innkeep pause. 4 coppers each if you last the afternoon," he said. "Nothing if you quit before the last barrel's loaded." "Fair," Marius said before Raina could object to being undervalued, and they set to work. The buckets were heavier than they looked. The path from pump to wagon was longer than it seemed. The festival crowd pressed close and impatient, and children darted underfoot like birds that had forgotten how to fly properly. But Riff had been trained to move through chaos without adding to it. Marius had learned to keep his footing on worse ground than this, and Raina discovered that if you heated your hands just slightly, the rope handles didn't bite quite so hard. They did not spill. By mid-afternoon, the innkeep had stopped watching them with suspicion and started watching them with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has made a good bargain by accident. When the last barrel was rolled into place and the wagon driver declared himself content, the innkeep came out with his purse already counted. 12 coppers, he said, and paid them in the courtyard where other workers could see that he was a man who kept his word. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "There's bread and cheese in the kitchen if you're hungry. Can't have you collapsing on my doorstep and giving the place a bad name." They sat on the bench outside the kitchen and divided the coins into 3 equal piles. The bread was yesterday's but honest. The cheese was sharp enough to make you pay attention, and their shoulders knew they had done something. "Put it in the book," Raina said, drunk on the ordinary pleasure of having earned what she held. "What book?" Marius asked, though he suspected he knew. Riff produced from her pack a small ledger covered in oilcloth and tied shut with a piece of merciless twine. She handed it to Marius with unexpected seriousness, as if she were handing him something more important than bound paper. "Your book," she said. He blinked. "Mine?" "You are the only one any merchant will fear," Riff said. "No malice in it, only accuracy. My mother says you learned sums from a woman who can make a tax cry uncle. I can do sums. I cannot make a man bid against himself." Marius did not pretend modesty. He accepted the ledger the way a smith accepts a good hammer, with the understanding that tools are meant to be used, not admired. He made the first entry with care, his handwriting small and precise. Water, 12 coppers, festival labour, fair rate. Then he underlined fair rate because it had a pleasant sound and because he could feel, somewhere under his ribs, his mother's approval at keeping the accounts tidy. The afternoon sun slanted through the courtyard, turning ordinary dust into something briefly golden, and three young people who had learned that work, honestly done, has its own kind of wealth sat together and were content. He turned out to be a hard bargain indeed. It was not that his mouth grew cruel. It was that he had been taught how to be silent. He would ask a question and then stand there with his hands in his pockets and let a talker talk himself down a step and then another. He would look at a ledger line and then look up and say, "The figure is correct, the conclusion is not," and the other party, if honest, would realise they had tried to be clever with a child who was no such thing and would amend. If not honest, Raina would begin to smile in a way that made Prudence discover new muscles, and Rife would shift her stance to free her lance of the duty of a traveller's staff. They found out early what work was worth what coin. They learned what work was worth by doing it, one job at a time. The byre hadn't been cleaned since the last honest king had a full set of teeth, which by the farmer's reckoning made it older than his grandfather's memory and meaner than his wife's temper. The smell hit them like a wall before they even opened the door. Decades of neglect composted into something that made eyes water and dignity reconsider its position. Riff took one look, planted her lance outside like a standard, and said, "Piece of silver, and the right to wash after," without being shouted at. The farmer, who had expected them to turn around, blinked twice and agreed. They worked in shifts because the air inside didn't believe in mercy, Marius with a shovel, Raina using just enough heat to dry the worst of it without setting the whole structure ablaze, Riff hauling the results out in buckets that seemed to get heavier with each trip. By afternoon, they'd turned archaeological layers of muck into something a cow might consider, and the farmer pointed to the pump without a word. They washed in silence, shoulders aching, hands raw, coins earned, and Marius wrote it down. Byre, 1 scylla piece, honest work, fair rate. The wagon wheel was stuck in a rut that had been cut by last spring's mud and hardened by summer into a trap for the unwary. The old mare stood patient in her traces, too tired to object and too wise to waste energy on hope. The carter was a man with 3 daughters at home and a load of pottery that would shatter if the wagon tipped, which it was about to do. "I'll pay a half silver if you can spare my horse the job," he said. "She's earned her retirement, but I can't afford to give it yet." Riff handed her lance to Raina, crouched low, and lifted with the kind of strength that comes from practice and spite in equal measure. Marius worked the wheel free with a lever and a prayer, and together they restowed the cargo, so the weight rode honest. The mare flicked her ears in what might have been gratitude. The carter paid them the half-silver and added 3 small cinnamon rolls wrapped in cloth. "For the girl with the lance," he said, and there was something in his voice that said he saw his daughter's future in Riffe's resolve, and was grateful for it. They ate the rolls on the road, still warm, and Marius recorded it as wagon repair. Half-silver and gratitude, honest strength rewarded. The caravan master was a man who had stopped believing court rumours of weather mages around the same time he'd stopped believing in his own youth, which made him practical, careful, and deeply suspicious of boys who claimed to forecast weather. But Marius stood in the wind and felt its weight and direction the way his father had taught him. Not magic exactly, just attention paid to the way air moves when it has opinions about the coming days. 3 days of contrary wind, he said, not boasting, just reporting. Then a mercy. The caravan master studied him the way you study a map you don't quite trust but can't afford to ignore. "A shilling now," he said. "Another on delivery if your mercy arrives on time." 3 days later the wind turned gentle as a promise kept, and the second shilling was paid without haggling. The bread oven had sulked since the first cold, which the grandmother took personally because she'd been firing that oven since before the current baker was born, and it had never had the audacity to quit on her before. She stood in her kitchen with her one good eye fixed on Raina and said, "Warm. Not flame. Warm." Raina only blazed a little in the ash door, just enough to remind the bricks they were meant to hold heat, not hoard it. The oven, affronted at having to obey, obeyed anyway. The grandmother paid them in 2 loaves, still warm, and advice. Bread is the only friend that never lies to your belly. Remember that. They ate 1 loaf on the spot and saved the other, and Marius recorded it as oven repair, 2 loaves and wisdom, fair trade. They also learned that there are arguments in the world that have been composting since the first field was fenced, and that no amount of goodwill, explanation, genealogy, scripture, or threat will convince a man who has decided that tonight, in this room, he will be a fool. The first fight came in a wayside tavern, wedged between 2 jurisdictions that had stopped speaking to one another over which side had the older bell. Everyone in the place knew this and had chosen to be reasonable about it for 22 years except for that night when the laughter turned into a standoff. Riff stepped between men who had put years into learning to be courteous about petty differences and were now ripe for any excuse. She had no badge to show. She had her mother's eyes by accident and her training on purpose. "Gentlemen," she said, with the kind of respect that presumes its own answer, "this is a flaw. I do not see a field to plough, a gate to take, a bell to wrestle. I see a woman about to serve soup that will be wasted if you spill it. Sit down." They did not sit. One of them began the old recitation. "You people, we people, the fields, the river, the fence that was a twig when my grandfather." The words were the sort that put holes into a room and fire into men's hearts. Marius tried courtesy. "We can draw lots," he said. "If the lots displease you, you may complain to the gods." The complaint to the gods is always popular. It almost worked. The cousin from the marsh leaned and said something out of habit that his head knew to be harmless and his mouth did not. Into the instant after the words left his lips, and before remorse, Raina sighed once, the way a cooking fire sighs when a lid fits correctly, and put a thread of heat across the air above the room, so fine that it drew a line of light along the rafters without touching them. Every head in the tavern looked up, because people are built that way. "What was that?" asked the room, none of it at once. "Perspective," Raina said. "It is late, the stew is good. You are about to make your wives tired for no reason, and the girl who is serving you has been on her feet since dawn." It was an offence to hope in that situation. The stew did not deserve to be punished for their old quarrel. Neither did the girl. They sat. Afterward, the innkeep came out with a jar of preserved pears and a certainty that he had understood nothing and everything. "I will pay you for the line in the air," he said stubbornly, because he was a man who put coin where gratitude would run away if not waited. "And I will pay your friend for the look he gave you before you did it, because it saved my ceiling. And I will not pay the knight," he added, because Riff had already refused payment. "But I will say her name when someone with sense asks me who stood between men and their foolishness tonight." "There is no need to say our names," Marius said quickly, for their names were not the sort of things they wanted let mentioned in gossip. "You may say, the night was Lady Riff of the Pass, with her friends if you must say anything. Or you may say nothing." The innkeep snorted. He counted out 6 coppers for the invisible line of heat and 3 for the saved rafters, and flicked his gaze to Rife. "You, I will pay in the currency you have chosen," he said, and nodded once as one soldier to another. Riffa did not ask what payment that was, but later, when they slept above the kitchen in a loft that was far from elegant and precisely right, she found a neat parcel at the head of her pallet. A roll of good linen bandage, a little pot of tallow for blisters, and a pair of squares of boiled leather cut to the shape of a knee. It was better than a coin. Rife told the others then what sort of assistance she would like the next time men decided to be fools, help to move the brawl outside and let her have her practice, as long as nobody is stupid enough to seek death. Others agreed. A tollman with a tired horse and a desire to remember himself important decided to double the rate for travellers on account of a flood that had not yet happened. He had 2 sons at home and a wife who would have corrected him if she had been present. She was not. Marius did sums out loud where the tollman could follow them, unhooked the man's own measuring chain, and measured the river properly while the man watched, knuckles white around his own bad mood. "This is the old mark," Marius said when he came back up the bank, tapping his boots against the stone to rid them of mud with the serene economy of a person who has decided to be dignified. "And that," he added, pointing to the upstream willow with a root that had learned to lift its own skirt out of the flowing water, "is the new. The flood that has not happened has not widened your river or your rights. We will pay the old rate." "You will pay," the man began, because sentences like that have been trained to leave mouths even in the presence of sense. Raif put her lance butt on the ground beside his boot. She did not say a word. Raina, who had lately learned the utility of not being first, looked at the sky and kept her mouth closed around heat. The tollman found himself with the unexpected luxury of hearing his own conscience in the sudden quiet. It did not like what he was doing either. "My sons will mock me for this," he grumbled, finding his dignity by taking less coin. "But my wife will not, and that is a better rate." They paid the fair rate. Marius put a note into the ledger. Toll, 2 pennies. Old mark holds. Wife's good sense. And underlined the last part because justice ought to be recorded somewhere, even if the only reader is a boy who has decided to be a man exactly at the speed that allows him to be kind. They learned that safety can be bought with work as well as money. On 2 nights they paid for their bed with guard duty by the gate, half by request and half because Rif had put herself there without asking, and the captain at once discovered that his rota, long a bother, had grown easier. Raif walked the wall, counting the dark with her feet. On another night, they paid entirely in song, Marius pretending not to enjoy himself while he played a tune with a bottle and a comb, and Raina sang a market lullaby she had learned from a baker who did not think she was paying attention. It was not a good song. It was sufficient for being allowed to sleep in the stable loft, and some soup. Marius kept the purse along with the ledger. At first, Raina minded. Not because she wanted the coin in her hand, but because she had been born to a sky that would not be stinted, and the idea of counting a pleasure before agreeing to it made her teeth grate. Then she learned that a budget is an oath you make to a future you would like to greet with pride. She discovered the joy peculiar to people who have learned to want slowly, buying pears because they had earned them, not because they wanted them. Bread, beds, and gear, Marius recited on mornings when the purse felt light. After that, if we have enough for a pair, we will be extravagant. The tollman was wise by virtue of having a good wife. Many men, finding a girl with a lance offensive after a pint or 3, were neither wise nor blessed with such a wife, and had to be persuaded by other means. One such lesson came in a village too small to have earned a proper name, but large enough to have a tavern that served ale strong enough to make men forget why they had learned to be polite. Rif had been standing by the door, lance in hand, waiting for Marius to finish haggling over the price of grain, when a voice from the corner decided that women with weapons were an offence to the natural order and said so. She ignored it. The voice grew louder, fueled by agreement from friends who had nothing better to do than make poor decisions together. It said things about women and their place, and what happened to girls who carried sticks they didn't know how to use. The tavern went quiet in the way rooms do when people are deciding whether to be entertained or ashamed. Ref turned. "Gentlemen," she said, in the tone one uses when the word is a courtesy and not a description. "I am standing by a door. You are sitting by your ale. We need not trouble one another." One of them stood. He was the kind of man who had been strong once and now wore the memory of it badly, poured into a frame that had started to disagree with his ambitions. "Girl's got a mouth," he said to his friends as if she weren't standing there. "Maybe she needs teaching." Marius's hand went to his belt where a knife lived for cutting bread and other purposes. Raina, who had been warming her hands by the fire, let a small thread of heat curl up the back of her neck. Not visible, just a reminder to herself of what she could do if courtesy failed. Riff lifted one hand, palm out, to both of them. The gesture said clearly, "Mine." She set her lance against the wall where it could be retrieved but would not be trampled, and stepped into the open space between tables that all taverns keep for this exact purpose. "Outside," she said. The man blinked. He'd expected tears or perhaps a retreat to hide behind the boy with the ledger. He had not expected an invitation. "What?" "Outside," Riff repeated. "You want to teach. I want to practice. But I will not break the furniture of a man who has done me no wrong." She nodded to the innkeep who was watching with the expression of someone calculating the cost of new chairs against the entertainment value of watching someone learn an expensive lesson. The man's friends made the noises men make when they have been given permission to be fools. They went outside, trailing bravado and ale breath into the evening. The tavern emptied after them like water finding a hole. In the yard, Riff waited. The man came at her with the confidence of someone who had won fights before by being bigger and meaner and willing to hurt people who weren't ready for it. He swung wide the way drunks do, putting his weight behind it. She wasn't there. Alaris's instruction had been clear. Be somewhere else when the fist arrives. She stepped inside his reach, used his own momentum to turn him, and put a foot precisely where his knee would discover it and reconsider its loyalties. He went down hard, not injured, but surprised in a way that sobered him faster than any well or cold water. His friends, who had expected to watch a girl learn fear, discovered they were watching their companions study the ground. One of them, braver or stupider than the rest, stepped forward. 2-on-1 isn't teaching," Marius called from the doorway. "It's arithmetic you won't like." Raina didn't say anything. She simply let her eyes go the colour they went when fire was thinking about being helpful, and smiled. The second man reconsidered. Rife offered her hand to the first man. He stared at it as if it were a trap, which it was not. Just a hand, scarred and work-hardened, and capable of pulling him to his feet or putting him back down if he chose poorly. He took it. She hauled him up with the ease of someone who had lifted hay bales and water buckets and wounded friends. "You're slow when you're angry," she said, not unkindly, "and you swing wide. If I'd wanted to hurt you, you'd be bleeding. Remember that the next time you think a woman with a weapon doesn't know what she's doing." He nodded, face red with something that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite respect, but was learning how to become both. Back inside, the innkeep poured Riff a cup of water she hadn't asked for and set it down without a word. Marius closed his ledger and tucked it away. Raina let her eyes go back to their ordinary colour. "That," Riff said, wiping her hands on her trousers, "is why I asked you to help me move them outside, so I can practice without breaking what isn't mine to break." Marius nodded. "How many more of these do you think we'll have before people learn?" "As many as it takes," Riff said. She retrieved her lance, checked it for damage out of habit, and leaned it against her shoulder. Outside, in the yard, a man sat on a bench rubbing his knee and explaining to his friends how he'd almost had her, if only the ground hadn't been so uneven. They nodded and agreed because that's what friends do, and because sometimes the kindest thing is to let a man keep a small lie that helps him walk home with his head up. Inside, 3 young people who had learned that the world teaches its lessons whether you ask for them or not finished their business, paid their coin, and moved on. Marius was carefully putting ointment on a fresh bruise she could not reach herself one night after yet another brawl Riff had tackled alone when he asked quietly, "Why?" And Riff sighed. "So I know how to hit someone who has no honour and no skill in a way it hurts but does not maim." so I know how to teach manners to my own flesh and blood." Marius understood. Rif was told by the oracle long ago that she would find her absent father on this journey to where 4 kingdoms meet. He worried what would happen when she met the man who had made her and the choice about a white gown she would need to make, but said nothing, for his own prophecy was becoming uncomfortably heavy in his chest. He had been promised a hidden Eastern princess for a queen, but an odd reluctance had started to grow in his chest. His heart was already set on a queen, but not the one the oracle had named. Even he himself did not dare to look at the truth of it yet. Rhaena's prophecy had promised a mate, but one she would need to teach to be himself. A dragon awakened too late and broken by the change, a task that was at least easy to understand, if not easy to complete. They bought a map, and then did not use it because the roads were telling them their own stories, and maps are polite liars, even when they are right. They learned where 4 kingdoms touch not by finding a marker stone, but by breathing 4 different laws in 1 mile. At the top of a rise, the bell changed tone. In the hollow, the tax collector wore his sash on the other shoulder. A woman wove rush mats and used a different name for them. A boy sold eels with a word for price Rif didn't know. That night, they slept in a kiln house, yawning with the breath of lamps and glass. The master was a woman with one good eye and no patience for people who made heat noisy. "Warm," she said to Rhaena, jerking her chin at an annealing oven. "Not flame. Warm. If you scorch my goods, I will charge you the price of the sand." Rhaena put her hands on the bricks and spoke to the stubborn thing quietly. The oven obeyed. Marius negotiated a discount for sleeping by the wall, where the blowpipes cast slant shadows, and Rife found herself apprenticed for 3 hours to a glassblower who handed her a pipe and said, "Do not blow until I tell you," then did not tell her for a very long time to teach her the taste of patience. That night, when the apprentices had gone to make foolishness out of fatigue in the yard, the 3 sat close to a heat that would not burn them without invitation. "We are close," Marius said, not because of any landmark, but because the air had learned 4 accents at once and seemed pleased with itself. "Close to what?" Rhaena asked, as if daring fate to be specific. "The place where it will be our business to know what to do," Riffa answered, tying her bandage roll with a neatness that made the linens seem to approve of being wrapped. "Which is worse than being told." Rhaena grinned without joy. "I will gladly take it worse over waiting on a dais for people to bow properly." Marius closed the ledger and knotted the purse to the inside of his belt where no hand could find it without ambition. He had become the man he disliked to meet across a bargaining table. Calm, certain, fair, occasionally ruthless on behalf of people who would not be. For 3 days they stayed with the glassblowers. The glassmaster's one good eye had cut toward the east when she spoke of rumours the way professionals do when gossip comes to fill the tedium of a well-worn task. A beast in the forests of the east, one of Rhaena's kind, but one who was only ever a beast and never a man, wild and dangerous. There was a bounty out for ridding the land of its scourge. The 3 looked at each other and nodded. This sounded familiar, this sounded like something they were looking for. Something that promised both fulfillment to their prophecy and addition to their light coin purse. They slept, because tomorrow would not, and then they headed east following the scent of a rumour.